Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, we haven't really talked a lot about the War of 1812 on this channel, so people have requested it every so often, thought it might be a good time to dive into it. So we are going to be visiting the channel Crash Course, which I know a lot of you are familiar with. They have almost 14 million subscribers, so they're doing quite well. There is a link in the description to the original content if you want to check it out without my commentary or check out a lot of their other great content. But we're going to dive into their War of 1812 Crash Course today, and we'll see what it's all about. And as always, I will add my commentary where I can, try to fill in a bit more information. I haven't seen the video yet, so let's see what it's all about.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to talk about what America's best at: war. Mr. Green, the United States has actually only declared war 5 times in the last 230 years. Oh, me from the past, you sniveling literalist. Well, today...
Okay, so let's talk about that. Let's think here. Declared war, actual declarations of war by Congress, War of 1812, Mexican-American War, World War I, World War II, and Spanish-American War. I don't believe we have actually declared war since World War II, so I think those are probably the 5.
We're going to talk about America's first declared war, the War of 1812, so called because historians are terrible at naming things. I mean, they could have called it the Revolutionary War Part 2, or the Canadian Cataclysm, or the War to Facilitate Future Wars.
Revolutionary War Part 2 is probably pretty accurate because, I mean, it is. But it's 40 years later. I mean, it's, 35 years after the American Revolution, and probably rightly more called the American War for Independence than Revolution. But yeah, and it really is kind of a follow-up, and it's kind of dealing with some unresolved issues from that first war. It's fair to connect the two, I think. It's fair to say that there are some lingering things that needed to be resolved.
But no, they just named it after the year it started. I know this disappoints the military historians among you, but as usual, we're going to spend more time talking about the causes and effects of the war than the actual, killing parts, because ultimately, it's the ambiguity of the War of 1812 that makes it so interesting. The reason most often given for the War of 1812 was the British impressment of American sailors, whereby American sailors would be kidnapped and basically forced into British servitude.
So, impressment is the thing that we talk about the most, and like any historical event, we love to simplify it. We love to break it down to its biggest common denominator, right? Revolutionary War, it was all about taxation without representation. Well, yeah, that was part of it, but there were so many other reasons besides that. Yeah, impressment is what we like to talk about, but yeah, there were so many other layers to that. And here, at least in the United States, it spun as, like he said, the British were stopping American ships and kidnapping Americans off of ships and pressing them into the British Navy, and that was a righteous reason to go to war. Well, yeah, it wasn't quite so simple. A lot of those guys actually were British, so...
This disrupted American shipping. It also seems like a reasonably obvious violation of American sovereignty, but it's a little more complicated than that. First of all, there were many thousands of British sailors working aboard American ships, so many of the sailors that the British captured were in fact British. Which gets to the larger point that citizenship at the time was a pretty slippery concept, especially on the high seas. Papers were often forged, and many sailors identified their supposed Americanness through tattoos of, eagles and flags. And
remember, this is a time in history, people didn't have birth certificates and passports and stuff like that, where now it's I can prove I'm an American citizen because here's my birth certificate. Here's where it shows I was born in Ohio in 1977, right? And here's my passport that shows I'm an American citizen. You didn't have that kind of stuff. For example, in the U.S., birth and death certificates didn't become kind of a standard thing until the 20th century, the early part of the 20th century. Before that, a lot of records were recorded in county courthouses, in books, or in church records, things like that. So it wasn't really that simple.
And there were several reasons why a British sailor might want to become or pretend to be an American, including that the Brits at the time were fighting Napoleon in what historians, in their infinite creativity, called the Napoleonic Wars. And on that topic, Britain's impressment policy allowed them both to disrupt American shipping to France and to get new British sailors to strengthen their war effort, which was annoying to the Americans on a couple levels, especially the French-loving Republicans, which is a phrase that you don't hear very often anymore.
So, again, great point that the War of 1812, remember, is going on at the same time as the Napoleonic Wars. The British have their hands full as part of coalitions against Napoleon. So the War of 1812 is kind of like this side quest that they have going on with the Americans. And, it's just like with the, here in America, we talk about the French and Indian War, which was actually a part of a larger world war called the 7 Years' War. We Americans love to focus on our part of things without recognizing that it was a small part of a much bigger thing that was going on.
Another reason often given for the war was America's crazy conspiratorial Anglophobia. There was even a widespread rumor that British agents were buying up Connecticut sheep in order to sabotage the textile industry.
And that Anglophobia things, there's still remnants of that, right? This past couple of weeks with the passing of Queen Elizabeth II, I've seen a ton of Americans commenting on YouTube channels saying, yeah, well, we fought a war to get away from the monarchy, so I don't care. It's like this whole, because we broke away from them, anything that the British do is bad. We fought to get away from that stuff without recognizing the historic significance of the event itself. You can say, well, okay, we're not part of that country anymore and still recognize that the monarchy was significant to a lot of other people, but we have this kind of Anglophobia that says we broke away from them, so it's bad.
Worried that America's fascination with conspiracy theories is new. So those pushing for war were known as war hawks, and the most famous among them was Kentucky's Henry Clay. They took the impressment of sailors as an affront to American national honor, but they also complained that Britain's actions were an affront to free trade, by which they meant America's ability to trade with Europeans other than Great Britain. And to be fair, the British were trying to regulate American trade. They even passed the Orders in Council, which required American ships to dock in Britain and pay tax before trading with other European nations.
Now think about that. I mean, that is a bullying tactic if I ever heard one, right? You have to come to our country first and pay a tax before you can trade with other people. Now, granted, this was going on for several years before the War of 1812, but this just goes to show you that the War of 1812 was really kind of a build-up of things that had been going on. This was the British trying to have their hand in what the Americans were doing despite independence having taken place. It was really kind of the British trying to treat America like the little brother that they could boss around and make do what they wanted to. And America finally says, we've had enough.
Britain, we were an independent nation. You can't do that kind of stuff. We have a special relationship. It's not that special. But the problem with saying this caused the war is that the orders had been in effect for 5 years before the war started, and they were rescinded in 1812 before the U.S. declared war, although admittedly we didn't know about it because it didn't reach us until after we declared war. There was no Twitter.
But again, just because it had been rescinded by then doesn't mean it wasn't a compelling cause for war. Again, it was this build-up. It was this kind of growing tensions that were happening over time.
The reason for the war was Canada. That's right, Canada. Americans wanted you, and who can blame them with your excellent healthcare and your hockey and your first-rate national anthem? Stan, this is fun, but enough with the hashtag 1812 problems. According to Virginia Congressman John Rudolph, agrarian cupidity,
Randolph, not Rudolph,
not maritime rights, urges the war. We have heard but one word: Canada. Canada. Canada! I'm not here to criticize you, John Randolph, but that's actually 3 words. Now, some historians disagree with this, but the relentless pursuit of new land certainly fits in with the Jeffersonian model of an agrarian republic. And there's another factor that figured into America's decision to go to war: expansion into territory controlled by Native Americans. Oh, it's time for the mystery document?
And this was a big cause of the American Revolution, too. As I mentioned, it wasn't just taxation without representation. The British had this agreement where they weren't gonna expand past the Appalachian Mountains. And the Americans saw all that land over there ripe for the taking. And so the American Revolution allowed that to open up to settlement.
The rules here are simple. I try to guess the author of the mystery document. Usually I'm wrong and I get shocked. All right, let's see what we got here. You want, by your distinctions of Indian tribes and allotting to each a particular tract of land, to make them to war with each other. You never see an Indian come and endeavor to make the white people do so. It's Tecumseh, drop the mic! Is something that I would do, except that the mic is actually attached to my shirt, so there's no drama in this. Clearly a Native American criticism of white people, and I happen to know that that particular one comes from Tecumseh, and I don't get shocked today! So it shouldn't come as a surprise that Americans were continuing to push westward into territory where Indians were living.
Manifest destiny, the idea that America is meant to own everything from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. And hey, by the way, Canada up there, America's hat, we could use that too.
I mean, this was a big reason for the Louisiana Purchase, after all. By the beginning of the war, more than 400,000 settlers had moved into territories west of the original 13 colonies, and they outnumbered American Indians by a significant margin. Some native groups responded with a measure of assimilation. Cherokees like John Ross wanted to become more civilized, that is, more white and farmery, and some of them did even adopt such civilized practices as written languages and slavery, the most civilized practice of all. People are always like, why aren't you more celebratory of American history? Well, why isn't there more to celebrate? But other Indians wanted to resist. The best known of these were the aforementioned Tecumseh and his brother Stan, can you just put on the screen? Yes, let's just enjoy looking at that. Right, that's just for all you visual learners. So he was also known as the Prophet because of his religious teachings and also because of the pronunciation issues. The Prophet encouraged Indians, especially those living in and around the settlement of Prophetstown, to abandon the ways of the whites, primarily in the form of alcohol and manufactured consumer goods. So stop drinking alcohol and eating refined sugars. This guy sounds like my doctor. Tecumseh was more militant, attempting to revive Neolon's idea of pan-Indianism and actively resisting white settlement. As he put it, sell a country, why not sell the air, the great sea, as well as the earth?
So he's making the point there that to a lot of Native Americans, the European idea of ownership of land didn't really apply. They would roam territory, they would kind of come and go. Now, that's not to say they didn't fight over hunting grounds and they didn't fight over certain ground, but they just didn't have the same concepts of things that Europeans did. And the Europeans were, of course, imposing their ideas of, through treaties of territory and things like that on them. So I wouldn't go so far as to say it was a completely foreign concept to all Native Americans, but in this case, this shows you kind of the tension that's happening here. So there's tension between the colonies, the United States, and the United Kingdom. By this point, it is the UK, not Britain. But there's also tension moving westward. There's also tension with Canada to the north, which of course is part of the UK. So there's a lot of things going on here, and that's the important part of this, to understand that it is complicated, it's nuanced, there's multiple layers to what's happening.
Did not the Great Spirit make them all for the use of his children? The Americans responded to this reasonable criticism in the traditional manner, with guns. William Henry Harrison destroyed the native settlement at Prophetstown in what would become known as the Battle of Tippecanoe. He would later ride that fame all the way to the presidency in 1840, and then, spoiler alert, he would give the longest inauguration address ever, catch a cold, and die 40 days later.
I'll debate with him the part about him catching a cold because of the speech. It's not generally agreed that's why he died. May have been from the water supply or something else. But anyway, he was old, he was infirmed, and maybe catching a cold helped weaken his immune system and allowed something else to kill him. The Battle of Tippecanoe, he runs on that. Tippecanoe and Tyler too was his campaign slogan. So it was hearkening back to 30 years earlier when he won that famous battle, and he ends up being kind of one of the first great generals who was able to transition that fame into the White House. Spoiler
alert, he would give the longest inauguration address ever, catch a cold, and die 40 days later. Let that be a lesson to you American politicians. Long speeches, fatal. So I've just painted a pretty negative picture of the Americans' treatment of the Indians because it was awful, but I haven't mentioned how this relates to the War of 1812. The Americans were receiving reports that the British were encouraging Tecumseh, which they probably were. And the important thing to remember here is that the War of 1812, like the 7 Years' War and the American Revolution, was also a war against Indians, and as in those other two wars, the Indians were the biggest losers. And not in the cool way of the biggest loser where like Trainer Bob helps you lose weight, but in the really sad way where your entire civilization civilization gets John C. Calhoun. So the War of 1812 was the first time that the United States declared war on anybody. It was also the smallest margin of a declaration of war vote, 79 to 49 in the House and 19 to 13 in the Senate. Northern states, which relied on trade a lot, didn't want to go to war, while southern and western states, which were more agrarian and wanted expansion to get land for farming and slavery, did.
So, and again, this shows you that all throughout American history, there has been a fundamental divide between North and South in terms of politics. And it goes all the way back to not only the nature of the economy in the early days, but also the nature of settlement. You've got a lot of English settlers in the mid-Atlantic and northern states. The southern states were much more populated by people from Scots-Irish background, who generally had a disdain for strong central government and were much more agrarian and kind of different in the way they saw cities and things like that. And that continues to this day. I mean, the political parties change and the particular political issues change, but that natural kind of disdain for the government and disdain for Big Brother and that kind of stuff existed even then. And so you typically will see differences on the political issues. And in this case, one part of the country pro-war, one part against it.
The closeness of the vote reflects a profound ambivalence about the war. As Henry Adams wrote, "Many nations have gone to war in pure gaiety of the heart, but perhaps the United States were the first to force themselves into a war they dreaded, in the hope that the war itself might create the spirit they lacked." Don't worry, Henry Adams. In the future, we're going to get pretty gaiety of heartish about war. Anyway, as an actual war, the War of 1812 was something of a farce. Let's go to the thought bubble. The U.S. Army numbered 10 to 12,000, and its officers were sunk into either sloth, ignorance, or habits of intemperate drinking.
Remember that there were a lot of folks in the U.S. just a generation or so before this who opposed even having a standing army of any kind. Thomas Jefferson was one of them, and he had just been president for most of the decade leading into this war. So they created West Point just a few years earlier so they could start training professional officers. But for the most part, the idea of a strong professional army was something that a lot of Americans, even politicians, were against.
The U.S. Navy had 17 ships. Great Britain had 1,000. Also, America had very little money. Britain collected 40 times more tax revenue than the U.S. But Britain was busy fighting Napoleon, which is why they didn't really start kicking America's butt until 1814, after Napoleon was defeated. Napoleon's defeat was also the end of the practice of impressment, since Britain didn't need so many sailors anymore. Initially, much of the war consisted of America's attempts to take Canada, which any map will show you went smashingly. Americans were confident that the Canadians would rush to join the U.S. When marching from Detroit, General William Hull informed the Canadians that, quote, "You will be emancipated from tyranny and oppression and restored to the dignified station of free men."
And this happened in the Revolution, too. There were expeditions up into Canada. Benedict Arnold was a part of one of those.
And the Canadians were like, yeah, we're okay, actually. And so the British in Canada, with their Indian allies, went ahead and captured Detroit and then forced Hull's surrender. America's lack of success in Canada was primarily attributable to terrible strategy. They might have succeeded if they'd taken Montreal, but they didn't want to march through northern New York because it was full of Federalists who were opposed to the war. Instead, they concentrated on the west, that is, the area around Detroit, where fighting went back and forth. The British found much more success, even seizing Washington, D.C. and burning the White House. In the course of the battle, British Admiral George Cockburn, overseeing the destruction of a newspaper.
Yeah, and the last time that you see an American commander-in-chief actually out in the field with an army, the president, James Madison, did that. Now, he didn't really lead the troops. I believe, like, the secretary, one of the cabinet secretaries was actually leading the troops. Might have been the Secretary of War. I feel like it was maybe Secretary of State or something, though, but I'm going to look that up. Yeah, so James Monroe, Secretary of State, actually, who was a military veteran, had been wounded at the Battle of Trenton during the American Revolution, actually was out in the field as well and had helped with the disposition of troops during the Battle of Bladensburg. So interesting stuff happening there.
Paper printing house told the forces that took the city, "Be sure that all the C's are destroyed so that the rascals cannot any longer abuse my name." It's hard out there for a cockburn. Thanks, Thought Bubble. Given these problems, it's amazing there were any American successes, but there were. The battleship USS Constitution broke the myth of British naval invincibility when cannonballs bounced off it and earned it the nickname Old Ironsides.
Oldest commissioned warship that actually still sails. The USS Constitution, I've been on board of it. It's a really cool ship. It's fascinating. It's pretty big, too. And they still take it out several times a year. It's up there in Boston. You can see it today.
Oliver Hazard Perry defeated a British fleet in, of all places, Lake Erie. At the Battle of the Thames, William Henry Harrison defeated Tecumseh, and the Battle of Horseshoe Bend showed one of the reasons why Indians were defeated when Andrew Jackson played one group of Creeks against another group of Creeks and Cherokees. 800 Indians were killed in that battle. And speaking of Jackson, the most notable American victory of the war was the Battle of New Orleans, which catapulted him to prominence. He lost only 71 men while inflicting 2,036 British casualties. Of course, the most memorable thing about the battle was that it took place 2 weeks after the peace treaty ending the war had been signed, but hey, that's not Jackson's fault. Again.
And listen, this is, a good 50 years or so before a telegraph cable was laid across the Atlantic Ocean, which made getting messages to and from a lot faster.
No Twitter, #1815 problems. The Treaty of Ghent, which ended the war, proved just how necessary the war had been. Not at all. No territory changed hands. When negotiations started in August 1814, the British asked for northern Maine, demilitarization of the Great Lakes, and some territory to create an independent nation for the Indians in the Northwest. But none of that happened, not because the U.S. was in a particularly good negotiating position, but because it would have been awkward for Great Britain to carve out pieces of the U.S. and then tell Russia and Prussia that they couldn't take pieces of Europe for themselves to celebrate their victory in the Napoleonic Wars.
So again, this goes to show you the complicated nature of all this, that it wasn't, you can't just look at North America in a bubble, in a vacuum, without considering what's happening in Europe elsewhere. These decisions have real-world impact in Europe, which is much more important. And what's happening in Europe with Napoleon and the aftermath of those wars has an impact on what's happening in North America. They're not completely separate entities. They do matter to each other.
There were no provisions in the treaty about impressment or free trade, and basically the treaty returned everything to the status quo, so neither the U.S. nor Britain actually won. But the Indians, who suffered significant casualties and gave up even more territory, definitely lost. So with a treaty like that, the war must have had a negligible impact on American history, right? Except no, the War of 1812 confirmed that the U.S. would exist. Britain would never invade America again until 1961. I mean, the U.S. were good customers, and Great Britain was happy to let them trade as long as that trade wasn't helping a French dictator. The war launched Andrew Jackson's career and solidified the settlement and conquest of land east of the Mississippi River, and our lack of success in Canada reinforced Canadian nationalism while also ensuring that instead of becoming one great nation, we would forever be Canada's pants.
Canada's pants. I like it. Just like we call Canada America's hat. And remember, the Secretary of State at this time is James Monroe. The Monroe Doctrine is going to become a big part of American policy, which is basically, we'll stay out of Europe, you stay out of North and South America. And it did. It kind of, for the next 100 years or so, for the most part, kind of separated what the U.S. was doing from what was happening in Europe. And it's only World War I where we really kind of jumped back in and basically completely ignore that.
War also spelled the end of the Federalist Party, which tried in 1815 with the Hartford Convention to change the Constitution. In retrospect, the Hartford Convention proposals actually look pretty reasonable. They wanted to eliminate the clause wherein black people were counted as 3/5 of a human and require a 2/3 congressional majority to declare war. But because they had their convention right before Jackson's victory at New Orleans, they only came off looking unpatriotic and out of touch.
And again, this shows that divide, right? And there was no way in the world that you were going to get the South to go back on the 3/5 compromise. That compromise was necessary to get the Constitution in the first place if you wanted to get the South on board. And it just further highlights the fact that there is this divide between North and South that's going to come to a head in the American Civil War 50 years later, and now just takes different forms.
as the elite so often do. It's hard to argue that Americans really won the War of 1812, but we felt like we won, and nothing unleashes national pride like war winning. The nationalistic fervor that emerged in the early 19th century was, like most things, good news for some and bad news for others. But what's important to remember, regardless of whether you're an American, is that after 1812, the United States saw itself not just as an independent nation, but as a big player on the world stage. For better and for worse, that's a gig we've held on to, and no matter how you feel about America's international interventions, you need to remember it didn't begin in Afghanistan or even Europe. It started with freaking Canada. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.
So let's talk about the numbers. So U.S. Army, 7,000 at the war start, 36,000 in the regular army at war's end, which is pretty comparable to the numbers that the British Army had on hand, but you also have hundreds of thousands of Americans who are called up in the militia, and that's where most people served in the War of 1812. You've got 515 privateers as far as the ships go, 2,200 killed in action. So in the entire 2 years of the American Revolution, not the American Revolution, in the entire 2 years of the War of 1812, between the U.S. and the British, you had about as many killed in action in 2 years of that war as were killed in one day at the Battle of Antietam in the American Civil War. That gives you a little bit of perspective. Now, granted, there were lots more who died from disease and who died in prison after being captured, things like that. But, I mean, those are the numbers we're talking about. 5,000 killed in combat. Maybe even less than that when you figure that the British 2,700 dead also counted disease. So, yeah, not a significant number by today's standards. But that gives you a little bit of an overview of the War of 1812. Obviously, like a lot of things, there's a lot more depth to the subject. And if you want to know more, I would encourage you to check it out and do some research on your own. But let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. And if you want to see more about this war, let me know, and maybe we'll explore the topic a little more in depth down the road. Thanks for watching.